A cul-de-sac at that time to get off the street. I remember the red and white grocery store from Brick House leaving a bag of groceries at the end of our driveway and then going away. And I remember as a child a piece of paper stuck to the front door of our house. That was a quarantine notice because my sister had polio. And people were deathly afraid, with good reason, of polio people with polio. It was far worse than our fear of AIDS 10 or 20 years ago. Swimming pools closed, meetings like this were discouraged, theaters closed because we didn't want to be in contact with anybody because children were being crippled, children were dying, and young adults. Polio in the 1940s and 50s in Canada and the United States and around the world didn't strike just little children, it was striking down young adults as well. So it's not too far from our community. Why did Rotary get into this? It started like all good projects, it started at the club level. It started in the 1970s in the Philippines, and a Rotary club like you sitting around and saying, why are our children getting polio in the Philippines when there's been an effective vaccine for over 20 years? And Rotarians care about children, they care about their community, and they said this is wrong, and they started buying vaccine and immunizing their children. And it's a very effective vaccine. And it didn't take long for their community to be polio free. And they looked around and they said, let's do it nationally. And the Rotarians in the Philippines said, let's eradicate polio from the Philippines. And they got one of the first large grants, at that time called 3H grants from our Rotary Foundation, $100,000 to buy vaccine. And it's an effective vaccine, and pretty soon the Philippines. So this started as a club project from the bottom up. And that's important to remember. And in the mid-80s, Rotary said, let's take this on as a world project. Let's eradicate polio from the world. Probably a pretty naive thing to think about in the 1980s. One disease that ever been eradicated, and that was 1979, the last case of smallpox worldwide. And smallpox, in fact, was an easier disease to eradicate. Every person in this room could diagnose a case of smallpox. It was visibly very evident when somebody had smallpox. So easier to do. So we took on this thing and we did what Rotary learned very quickly. We brought on a variety of partners. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control, UNICEF, World Health Organization as partners, and most recently the Gates Foundation. So jump forward to today when we started, 1,000 children a day, 350,000 children a year were getting polio, to today where there's a few hundred. We're down to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Not even the whole countries. Nigeria, it's in Kano State, a little bit in the north, very isolated. This year we celebrated the eradication, or excuse me, last year the eradication of polio in India. 1 billion people in India. We thought it would be the last place for polio. So why was I in the Sudan? Well, polio, the last case of polio in Sudan was recorded in 2009. The group that oversees the Horn of Africa polio campaign, which Rotary sits on, said we're concerned about Sudan. This is a dysfunctional country, it's not working. Can they really find cases of polio if they exist? So they do this periodically, and they send a team of doctors in to look at it, look at the records, not do vaccinations, but look at the health records and see if what they were doing. Rotary was asked to send an observer. I was invited to go along. So I went to Sudan April last year, and to South Sudan, and then January this year into North Sudan or Sudan to look at polio cases. Typical scene in Sudan, typical scene in Africa and Asia, polio survivor on a hand-built hand cart, hand cycle. You can see his knee, the weathered, atrophied legs that he crawls around on when he's not on his hand bicycle. He'll crawl. In the rainy season, he's pretty well isolated to his home. He can't get out because that bicycle can't get through the mud. So for up to 3 months, very isolated, but typical scene. And one of the reasons why they're so cognizant of polio, it's evident. Where we don't see polio, those are polio survivors here in Stevenson, there's polio survivors in Richmond, we don't see them. We see a person with a brace on their leg or a cane or a limp, and we don't realize that they're polio survivors. So a typical case. One of the things I was looking at was to also see was Rotary getting our recognition, and you'll see a Rotary wheel on those signs. The material they were producing locally had the Rotary wheel on. Did they know in Sudan who Rotary is? No. They knew, they recognized I was wearing a Rotary shirt most of the time. They recognized the Rotary wheel. They know Rotary cares about their children, but they don't know who Rotary is. There's only one Rotary club in Juba in South Sudan and one in Khartoum. The one in Khartoum actually has been around since the 1930s. So what we were doing, we're looking at acute flaccid paralysis. The first indication of polio, that's when children get paralysis of the legs and arms. The first indication that a child has polio is the paralysis. So when paralysis shows up, they want people to report this, and the mothers usually bring the children